Okay, so we've got the final part of War Photographer by Caroline Duffy. And if you've gone through in order, you've seen that Caroline Duffy tries to explain the juxtaposition really between a photographer's life away from home, where he has to witness warfare and conflict, and his life at home, which is relatively straightforward in rural England, and yet that's the place where he feels most worried because of all the memories he's surrounded by, all the photographs that he's taken, all the worry that is in his head about the danger that he's been in over the past few weeks or months. It's time to focus on the final stanza, and the final stanza offers us no solutions really to this particular job. We've got this idea of a cycle that the war photographer goes out to conflict, takes photographs, come back, and will always go again. It's that idea that war never ends. We finish with him flying back off to somewhere else. And Duffy's concluding with the war photographer believing that perhaps his work is pointless after all. We'll have a look at it and we'll juxtapose it with one of the key sentences that we looked at in the second part of War Photographer. He has a job to do. Let's just read the final stanza just to remind you. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So it's a marked contrast. Up until this point, the war photographer has, with some element of stress and worry, carried on with his job. He realises that what he has to do is important, to put pressure on the government, as I keep saying, to put pressure on the readership of the newspapers, to build awareness of the conflicts that are happening around the globe. The tone's different here. The tone feels helpless. It feels like he feels his job is pointless. He feels that the conflicts are never ending, and even if he does somehow finally stop or put pressure on stopping one conflict, that there's always more war, there's always more death, there's always more devastation somewhere else on the planet. 100 agonies, that very first image, 100 agonies. So we've got the sheer scale of the photographs that he's taken, and that sheer scale is reflective, of course, of the sheer scale of the conflicts around the globe. But 100 agonies, not 100 photographs, not 100 pictures, 100 agonies. And that word agonies has so much pain with it, doesn't it? So much suffering and anguish. Each one of those is a human being or human beings suffering with grief, with pain, with pure helplessness at the conflicts around the globe. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. There's a lot to be said about this first sentence really in the final stanza. First of all, we've got the idea of the process of what he has to do. So he takes his photographs. Of course, back when Duffy wrote this, back when newspapers were printed a while ago, they would have only had black and white pictures. It's only relatively recently, in the late 90s, that papers started printing colour photographs. So the black and white photographs are literally black and white. There was no colour in those. But maybe Duffy is also saying something about things being black and white, as in right or wrong, good or bad, and that stark contrast between the good and the bad, between peace and war, between life and death, is reflected in that lack of colour, in that monochrome tone that Duffy uses with the black or white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. Now, Sunday's supplement is a reference to the bigger papers that are delivered on a Sunday. Weekly papers tend to be quite thin because we're busy people, we've got work to go to, so we scan the newspapers. On a Sunday, there are supplements which are extra parts fitted into a newspaper, and they're designed to be read over morning breakfast, through the afternoon at leisure. So there's much more reading material in a supplement. And actually it's only in a Sunday supplement that wars around the world are covered at all really in the news. Other than that, they're largely ignored. So it's only on Sunday perhaps that these conflicts that the war photographer's exposing us to actually get the chance to be exposed. So that's quite an interesting thought in itself, that they're not important enough to be in everyday news. They're only important enough to be in the paper on a Sunday. And yet what do we do on a Sunday? We tend to relax, we tend to have time with our families, and that's referenced later on in the poem. But also you've got that juxtaposition between the 100 photographs that the war photographer has carefully taken. Remember, in the first stanza we've got the spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The photographer has thousands of images, perhaps 100 he selects to pass on to his editor. From those, only 5 or 6 actually get picked. So a lot of what he does already possibly feels quite useless, quite superfluous, quite unnecessary to what the editor wants, because only 5 or 6 of those are going to get picked. So that in itself starts to build this picture that the war photographer is actually dissatisfied with his job, starting to feel that he's not affecting any sort of change, starting to make him question whether the fact that he has a job to do is with any point whatsoever. It kind of feels pointless for him because so little of what he actually produces gets shown to the wider world. And then we've got these images. Now I've put bits of these images on the wall behind me because what we've got is the juxtapositions between normal life and conflict, the juxtapositions between what he's trying to do and how it's received, the juxtaposition between the time that people give to suffering and consider it and think about it and their normal lives as well. So the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. Let's take that as a sentence itself. So the reader is whoever is picking up that newspaper, of course. But the idea that they prick with tears, a prick, that is such a short, sharp pain. It's quick. It's over within seconds. And so it's only momentarily, it's only for a very short time that the reader actually considers the suffering that the war photographer is trying to put across to his audience. But even with that momentary pain, it's further juxtaposed with what happens next. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So they read the newspaper, but actually they forget about it very quickly because they're off out to lunch, they're off out to meet friends, they're off out to live their normal lives and not think about war at all. And actually, if you juxtapose tears and beers, you've got the sadness and jolly sort of ideas, haven't we? The idea that you share beers with other people is quite a joyful image, quite an idea of leisure, of socialising, and it couldn't be further away from the conflicts that the war photographer is trying to get across. But we've also got what's called internal rhyme. Most rhymes in poems occur at the end of lines, but when you've got an internal rhyme within the same line, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers, we're supposed to join those images even more. And the fact is that, as I've explained, tears and beers just do not go together. So they're supposed to be linked, and all it does with that juxtaposition is heighten and illustrate the idea that any sadness that the reader feels from the images that they've seen is very short-lived, and they can go on and enjoy their normal lives, which is what they do on a Sunday. And then the final couple of lines of the poem are the feeling of despair, perhaps, that the war photographer's feeling. So the poem actually ends with the sense that he's despairing of his job. He feels it's pointless. He feels helpless to actually bring about the change that he really wants to bring about. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. So the aeroplane obviously is flying back to the war zone. Again, you've got this cyclical structure of the poem. It starts with him at home, and then he's going back to the war zones, back to do the job he has to do. And he stares impassively, so he's just taking off perhaps from an airport in Britain, and he looks below at the land that's safe, at England, where there's very little trouble really compared to what's going on that he witnesses all the time. And we've got this adverb impassively. It comes from the same root as the word passion. And so passion is with emotion, with care, with feeling. But he's impassive. He's no longer caring about what he does. And from the sense in the start of that second stanza, he has a job to do, to the end, impassively, he's become tired of this life. He's become unfeeling to it. He has to do it to earn money. And that sense of he has the job to do takes on another meaning as well, that it is only a job to him now. Maybe he doesn't care about what he does, or maybe he's given up on trying to affect change. It's just bringing in the money for him, a strange way to earn money, but that's what he has to do now. And it no longer has that altruistic feeling about it, that feeling that he's doing it for a particular purpose, to bring about change, to make the world a better place. It is simply impassive now. He's only doing it to make money. He's only doing it because that's his job, where he earns his living and they do not care. So again, where he earns his living, we've not talked about money before in this poem. This is his living. And finally he's thinking about, not about bringing about change, but about bringing in money. And that's all his job is, because he's done it for so long now. He realizes that nothing's going to change. There's always going to be new war. There's always going to be suffering. There's always going to be conflict. There's always going to be death, because ultimately they do not care. That pronoun they do not care. Who is the they? Well, we could certainly refer to the readers. They do not care. We already know that straight after feeling that emotion briefly, they go out for their pre-lunch beers. But the they could take on a much wider significance, couldn't it? It could be governments. It could be war generals. It could be a whole range of different policy makers. The UN perhaps. Maybe nobody is doing enough to stop the wars that he in his own small way is trying to stop, which is why it's brought about that almost depression that he's feeling, that he's not going to make anything better at all. So it's a cyclical poem in terms of its structure. We start off in the dark room, but very much reflecting upon the warfare that he's seen, very much reflecting upon the experiences he's had, the photographs that he's taken. And we come back round at the end to going back out to another conflict. And that whole cyclical, that whole cycle to the structure of the poem means that nothing stops. War doesn't stop, the killing doesn't stop, deaths don't stop, devastation doesn't stop. And that's quite a depressing feeling, isn't it? That gives it a more universal feeling than just this war photographer. It's got a wider significance. What are we doing as a species? What are we doing as the human race to actually stop any potential conflict? And in this instance, it doesn't seem like anything is stopping, because we're back to the beginning again. He's flying back out on the aeroplane, back out to more war. Now in your exam, obviously you've got to start thinking about which poems this goes with. And I've given you some hints of some little images that link nicely to poems. In terms of its themes, it's about the effects of conflict. We've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. We've talked about how the blood stained into foreign dust. And those two ideas really link it very well to Remains by Simon Armitage. Equally, we've talked about the lacking of emotion, the impassive nature of the war photographer now. Perhaps in that sense it links quite nicely with Bayonet Charge, the soldier who becomes desensitized to war, who continues his charge towards the enemy, becoming the weapon himself. Anything where there's the effects of conflict, perhaps exposure to the idea that war is inevitable and so devastating and bringing about death. And although death is mentioned more obviously in Exposure. It's certainly hinted at in War Photographer. So any poems that deal with conflict, that deal with war, that deal with brutality, that deal with the effects of war, that deal with your own personality and human responses and feelings about war, you could link to War Photographer in those ways.